In the dusty streets of Bondoukoui, a small town in Burkina Faso, young Ibrahim Traoré walked barefoot to school every morning. The year was 1995, and 7-year-old Ibrahim carried his books in a worn plastic bag, his uniform patched multiple times by his mother's careful hands. Nobody in this quiet corner of West Africa could have imagined that this determined boy would one day become the continent's youngest president and earn a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. Ibrahim's father worked as a teacher in the local primary school, earning barely enough to feed his large family. His mother sold vegetables in the market, counting every coin to ensure her children could continue their education. The Traoré household was like many others in Burkina Faso, proud, hard-working, but struggling against the harsh realities of poverty and limited opportunities. Even as a child, Ibrahim showed unusual curiosity about the world around him. While other children played football in the dusty compounds after school, he would sit under the old baobab tree near his home, reading whatever books he could find. His father noticed this passion for learning and began bringing home extra textbooks from school. Ibrahim devoured them hungrily, often reading by candlelight late into the night. The young boy's interest in geology began during a school field trip to a local mining site. As he watched the miners extract gold from the earth, Ibrahim asked his teacher why his country remained so poor when it had such valuable resources underground. The teacher, caught off guard by the 8-year-old's question, could only shrug and say that was just how things were. But Ibrahim wasn't satisfied with that answer. As he grew older, Ibrahim became increasingly aware of the problems facing his country. He saw how foreign companies came to extract Burkina Faso's gold and other minerals, leaving little benefit for local communities. He watched as his classmates dropped out of school because their families couldn't afford the fees. He witnessed the frustration of young people who had no jobs and no hope for the future. During his teenage years, Ibrahim's academic excellence earned him a scholarship to study at a better school in the capital city, Ouagadougou. This move opened his eyes to an even wider world of inequality. In the capital, he saw wealthy neighborhoods with paved roads and constant electricity, while most people still lived in poverty. He observed how politicians made grand promises during election campaigns, only to forget about ordinary citizens once they gained power. Ibrahim threw himself into his studies with even greater determination. He excelled in mathematics and science, but he also developed a deep interest in history and politics. He spent hours in the university library, studying the lives of great African leaders like Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary president, who had been assassinated when Ibrahim was just a baby. Sankara's vision of an independent, self-reliant Africa resonated deeply with the young student. At university, Ibrahim chose to study geology, driven by his childhood fascination with his country's mineral wealth. He believed that understanding the Earth's resources was key to understanding how to develop his country properly. His professors were impressed by his dedication and his ability to connect geological knowledge with broader economic and political issues. During his university years, Ibrahim began to organize study groups and discussion forums with his fellow students. They would debate late into the night about corruption, foreign interference, and the lack of opportunities for young Africans. These conversations weren't just academic exercises. They were planning sessions for how to create real change. Ibrahim's reputation as a thoughtful leader grew among his peers. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. He had a gift for explaining complex ideas in simple terms that everyone could understand. More importantly, he always focused on solutions rather than just complaining about problems. After graduating with honors, Ibrahim faced the same challenge as most young Burkinabé, finding meaningful work in a country with limited opportunities. He could have tried to leave for Europe or America, as many of his classmates did. Instead, he chose to stay and fight for change from within. He took a job as a geology instructor at a technical school, where he could share his knowledge while continuing to build networks with like-minded young people. By day, Ibrahim taught students about rock formations and mineral deposits. By evening, he organized community meetings where he discussed with local residents how they could better benefit from their natural resources. He started small projects to help local communities negotiate better deals with mining companies operating in their areas. Ibrahim's work didn't go unnoticed. Local communities began to trust him as someone who genuinely cared about their welfare rather than personal gain. Unlike many educated young men who looked down on rural communities, Ibrahim always treated everyone with respect and listened carefully to their concerns. He learned as much from village elders as he taught them about geology and economics. As political instability grew in Burkina Faso, with various military coups and civilian governments failing to address the country's problems, Ibrahim watched and learned. He studied how each regime rose and fell, identifying what worked and what didn't. He began to develop his own vision for how the country could be transformed. The turning point came when Ibrahim decided to join the military. This decision surprised many of his friends and family, who expected him to pursue a career in academia or the private sector. But Ibrahim had concluded that real change in Burkina Faso would require someone who understood both civilian needs and military realities. He believed that lasting transformation had to come from within the system, not from outside protests that could be easily ignored or suppressed. Ibrahim's military training revealed new leadership qualities that had been developing quietly for years. His fellow soldiers respected his intelligence and his genuine concern for their welfare. Unlike many officers who treated enlisted men poorly, Ibrahim took time to understand the challenges faced by ordinary soldiers and their families. As Ibrahim advanced through military ranks, he never forgot his roots or his ultimate goal of serving his people. He continued to study, to learn, and to build relationships across all levels of Burkinabe society. Little did anyone know that this quiet, thoughtful young officer was preparing for a moment that would change not just his own life, but the entire trajectory of his nation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window of his modest military quarters in Ouagadougou, watching the sun rise over a country that seemed trapped in an endless cycle of poverty and disappointment. It was early 2021, and at 34 years old, he had already witnessed more political chaos than most people see in a lifetime. 3 different presidents had ruled Burkina Faso since he joined the military, each promising change but delivering more of the same corruption and stagnation. The security situation in Burkina Faso was deteriorating rapidly. Jihadist groups from neighboring Mali had infiltrated the northern regions, terrorizing local communities and making large areas of the country unsafe for ordinary citizens. Every week brought news of another attack, another village abandoned, another group of families fleeing their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Ibrahim had been deployed to several of these troubled regions as part of anti-terrorism operations. What he saw there broke his heart and opened his eyes to the depth of his country's problems. Government soldiers were poorly equipped, often lacking basic supplies like food, ammunition, and medical kits. Meanwhile, reports surfaced regularly about military budgets being diverted to private bank accounts of senior officials. During one particularly difficult mission in the northern province of Soum, Ibrahim's unit came under attack while trying to protect a village from jihadist raiders. 3 of his men were wounded, but the promised medical evacuation helicopter never came. Ibrahim had to watch one of his soldiers, a young man barely 20 years old, die from injuries that could have been treated if they had received proper support. That night, as Ibrahim sat beside the grave they had dug for their fallen comrade, he made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer serve in a system that sent young men to die while their leaders lived in luxury. Something had to change, and if the current leadership wouldn't make those changes, then new leadership was needed. Ibrahim began quietly reaching out to other military officers who shared his frustrations. He was careful and methodical, knowing that premature action could result in imprisonment or worse. He spent months building trust, listening to complaints from soldiers at all levels, and developing a clear understanding of what needed to be done. What made Ibrahim different from typical military coup plotters was his genuine concern for civilian welfare and democratic principles. He didn't want to seize power for personal gain or to install another military dictatorship. Instead, he envisioned a transitional government that would address immediate security concerns while preparing the country for truly democratic elections. The breaking point came in January 2022, when President Roch Kabore's government failed spectacularly to respond to another major terrorist attack. Jihadists had killed dozens of civilians in the northern town of Inada, and government forces had been completely unable to prevent the massacre or respond effectively afterward. Public anger reached a boiling point, with protesters taking to the streets demanding Traoré's resignation. Ibrahim watched the protest with interest, noting how ordinary citizens were expressing the same frustrations he had been hearing from soldiers for years. The disconnect between the ruling elite and the suffering masses had become impossible to ignore. Young people especially were angry about unemployment, corruption, and the government's inability to provide basic security. On the evening of January 23, 2022, Ibrahim gathered with a small group of trusted military colleagues in a safe house in Ouagadougou. The group included soldiers from different ethnic backgrounds and regions, united not by tribal loyalty, but by shared commitment to their country's welfare. They spent hours discussing their plans, ensuring that any action they took would minimize harm to civilians and create space for genuine democratic reform. Ibrahim insisted that their movement should have clear principles from the beginning. They would not engage in revenge against former officials, would protect civilian rights, and would work toward elections as soon as the security situation improved. These principles set their planned action apart from typical African military coups, which often resulted in years of authoritarian rule. The coup itself was swift and largely bloodless. On January 24, 2022, Ibrahim and his colleagues took control of key government buildings and military installations. President Traoré was arrested but treated with dignity, reflecting Ibrahim's commitment to avoiding the brutality that had characterized previous regime changes in the region. What happened next surprised many observers both inside and outside Burkina Faso. Instead of immediately declaring himself president, Ibrahim announced the formation of a patriotic movement for safeguard and restoration, with collective leadership and a clear timeline for returning the country to civilian rule. This approach demonstrated political maturity unusual in someone so young. The international community initially condemned the coup, as they typically do with any military takeover in Africa. However, many ordinary Burkinabe citizens celebrated in the streets, seeing Ibrahim and his colleagues as liberators who had finally removed a corrupt and incompetent government. The contrast between official diplomatic disapproval and popular enthusiasm created an interesting dynamic that Ibrahim would have to navigate carefully. Ibrahim's first major challenge as a leader came immediately after the coup. He had to demonstrate that his government was different from previous military regimes, while also addressing the urgent security problems that had triggered their action. He began by meeting with traditional chiefs, religious leaders, and civil society representatives, seeking broad input on how to move the country forward. One of Ibrahim's early decisions that surprised many people was his choice to live modestly and maintain his simple lifestyle even after becoming head of state. While previous leaders had moved into luxurious presidential palaces, Ibrahim continued to live in basic quarters and drove himself to meetings in an ordinary pickup truck. This symbolic gesture resonated powerfully with ordinary citizens who were tired of leaders who enriched themselves at public expense. Ibrahim also immediately began addressing the military's equipment and morale problems that he had witnessed firsthand as a soldier. He redirected funds from unnecessary presidential expenses toward buying proper gear for troops fighting terrorism. He personally visited military bases to speak with soldiers, listening to their concerns and ensuring they had what they needed to do their jobs effectively. Perhaps most importantly, Ibrahim began articulating a vision for Burkina Faso that went beyond simply fighting terrorism or reducing corruption. He spoke about transforming the country's economy to benefit ordinary citizens rather than foreign corporations and local elites. He talked about empowering young people and creating opportunities for them to build better lives without having to emigrate to Europe. As 2022 progressed, Ibrahim faced increasing pressure from various sources. Some international partners wanted him to hold elections immediately, regardless of security conditions. Some domestic critics accused him of being too young and inexperienced. Some within the military thought he was being too soft on former officials and should crack down more harshly on opposition. Through all these pressures, Ibrahim remained focused on his core principles and long-term vision for the country. He understood that real change would take time and require patience from everyone involved. He also knew that he was being watched closely by other African countries where young people were similarly frustrated with corrupt, ineffective leadership. The cool morning air of September 30th, 2022, carried an electric tension through the streets of Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré, now 34 years old, sat in his modest office, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a troubling picture. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, who had been leading the transitional government since the January coup, was losing support rapidly among both military officers and civilian population. Ibrahim had initially supported Damiba's leadership after the January coup, believing in collective decision-making and gradual reform. However, 8 months later, it was clear that the security situation had not improved significantly. Terrorist attacks continued to plague northern regions, and many soldiers felt that Damiba was too focused on international diplomacy rather than addressing urgent domestic problems. The tipping point came when reports surfaced suggesting that Damiba was secretly negotiating with French officials about maintaining certain colonial-era agreements that many Burkinabé viewed as exploitative. For Ibrahim and many of his military colleagues, this represented exactly the kind of foreign interference that kept African countries dependent and underdeveloped. Ibrahim had spent months building broader support within the military while carefully observing Damiba's leadership style. Unlike the hasty planning that characterized many military coups, Ibrahim's approach was methodical and strategic. He held countless meetings with officers from different units, listening to their concerns and gradually building consensus around the need for new leadership. What distinguished Ibrahim from other military leaders was his ability to connect military concerns with civilian aspirations. He understood that sustainable governance required more than just military support. It needed genuine popular legitimacy. Throughout 2022, he had quietly maintained contacts with student organizations, labor unions, traditional authorities, and civil society groups. On the morning of September 30th, Ibrahim's supporters moved decisively but carefully. They surrounded key government installations and military bases, ensuring that Damiba's loyalists could not organize effective resistance. The operation was completed within hours, with minimal violence and no civilian casualties. When Ibrahim appeared on national television that evening to announce the change in leadership, he looked calm and determined rather than triumphant. At 34 years old, he had just become Africa's youngest head of state, but he spoke with the gravity of someone who understood the enormous responsibilities ahead. His first speech as leader was remarkably different from typical coup announcements. Instead of making grand promises or attacking his predecessors, Ibrahim spoke directly to ordinary citizens about their daily struggles. He acknowledged that people were tired of hearing about changes that never materialized, and he committed to judging his leadership by concrete results rather than rhetoric. Ibrahim's immediate priorities were clear and practical. He promised to improve security conditions in the northern regions within 6 months, to reduce corruption in government institutions, and to renegotiate international agreements that did not serve Burkina Faso's interests. These weren't abstract, political slogans. They were specific commitments that could be measured and evaluated. The international response to Ibrahim's rise was initially skeptical, as expected for any military takeover. However, several factors made his situation different from typical African coups. First, he had clear popular support, demonstrated by enthusiastic crowds celebrating in major cities. Second, he immediately articulated a vision that went beyond personal power to address systemic problems. Third, his youth and background resonated with a generation of young Africans frustrated with aging, corrupt leaders. Ibrahim's first major policy decision showed his commitment to economic independence. He announced that Burkina Faso would review all mining contracts with foreign companies, ensuring that more benefits from the country's gold and other mineral resources stayed within the country. This decision sent shockwaves through international business circles, but was wildly popular among ordinary Burkinabé, who had watched foreign companies extract billions of dollars worth of resources while local communities remained poor. Perhaps, more importantly, Ibrahim began implementing immediate reforms in military operations against terrorism. He restructured command systems to reduce bureaucracy and improve response times. He established direct communication channels between field commanders and national leadership, eliminating layers of inefficient administration that had previously slowed decision-making. Ibrahim also made a controversial but strategically important decision to reduce Burkina Faso's military cooperation with France, the former colonial power. While this decision created diplomatic tensions with Paris, it was extremely popular domestically and aligned with growing sentiment across West Africa that French military presence was part of the problem rather than the solution. The young leader's approach to governance was notably different from his predecessors. Instead of isolating himself in presidential palaces, Ibrahim maintained regular contact with ordinary citizens. He held public meetings in markets, visited schools and hospitals, and made unannounced inspections of government offices to check on service delivery. One incident that particularly enhanced Ibrahim's reputation occurred when he personally drove to a hospital in Ouagadougou after receiving complaints about poor treatment of patients. He arrived unannounced, found several problems including shortages of basic medicines, and immediately fired the hospital administrator while ordering emergency supplies. Videos of this visit, showing the president arguing with bureaucrats about patient care, went viral across African social media. Ibrahim's leadership style was also marked by unusual transparency for an African head of state. He regularly appeared on local radio programs to answer questions from citizens, published government expenditures online, and encouraged investigative journalism rather than censoring critics. This openness built trust with many people who had become cynical about political leadership. However, Ibrahim's rise also created significant challenges and enemies. Some international partners were uncomfortable with his independence and his criticism of foreign interference in African affairs. Some domestic elites who had benefited from previous corrupt systems felt threatened by his reform agenda. Some neighboring countries worried that his example might inspire similar changes in their own nations. The most serious immediate challenge was the ongoing security crisis. While Ibrahim's military reforms had improved morale and coordination among government forces, the jihadist threat remained serious. Several major attacks occurred during his first months in power, testing his credibility and forcing him to balance military responses with diplomatic efforts to address underlying grievances. Ibrahim's response to these security challenges demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his commitment to protecting civilians. Instead of simply increasing military operations, he launched community engagement programs in affected regions, addressing issues like unemployment and lack of government services that made young people vulnerable to radical recruitment. By the end of 2022, just 3 months after taking power, Ibrahim had already begun transforming Burkina Faso's international relationships. He strengthened ties with other African countries while reducing dependence on former colonial powers. He reached out to new partners, including other developing countries that offered cooperation without the political conditions typically imposed by Western nations. As 2023 began, Ibrahim Traoré found himself at the center of continental and global attention. His youth, his principles, and his early successes had made him a symbol of hope for millions of young Africans who wanted to see their continent develop on its own terms rather than according to foreign dictates. The year 2023 marked a dramatic transformation in how the world viewed Ibrahim Traoré and his leadership of Burkina Faso. What had begun as skepticism about another African military coup evolved into fascination with a young leader who seemed determined to chart a completely new course for his country and continent. Ibrahim's daily routine as president remained remarkably simple compared to other world leaders. He still woke up at 5 in the morning, spending the first hour reading intelligence reports and international news. Instead of living in the grand presidential palace, he chose to remain in modest quarters at a military base, explaining to critics that luxury was inappropriate while most of his citizens lived in poverty. The young president's most controversial decision came in March 2023, when he announced that Burkina Faso would leave the France-backed CFA currency system and develop its own national currency. This decision sent shockwaves through international financial markets and prompted angry responses from several Western governments. However, Ibrahim argued that monetary independence was essential for true economic sovereignty. During a passionate speech at the University of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim explained his vision to a packed auditorium of students who hung on his every word. He spoke about how the CFA franc, used by 14 African countries, was designed to benefit French banks and businesses rather than African development. He showed charts demonstrating how CFA countries had experienced slower economic growth compared to African nations with independent currencies. The students erupted in applause when Ibrahim declared that Burkina Faso would mint its own coins and print its own money, with images of Thomas Sankara and other African heroes rather than French colonial figures. This symbolic gesture resonated powerfully across Africa, inspiring similar discussions in other CFA countries about monetary independence. Ibrahim's economic policies went far beyond currency reform. He announced a comprehensive plan to transform Burkina Faso's economy from dependence on raw material exports to local processing and manufacturing. Instead of simply selling gold ore to foreign companies, the government began building refineries to produce finished gold products that could be sold at higher prices. The mining sector became a particular focus of Ibrahim's reforms. He personally visited mining sites across the country, speaking with both foreign executives and local workers to understand how operations could benefit Burkinabe people more effectively. His government renegotiated several major mining contracts, ensuring that a higher percentage of profits remained in the country, while foreign companies still earned reasonable returns on their investments. One of Ibrahim's most innovative programs was the creation of youth cooperatives in rural areas. Instead of allowing young people to migrate to overcrowded cities or attempt dangerous journeys to Europe, the government provided training, equipment, and credit to help them start agricultural and small manufacturing businesses in their home communities. These programs were funded partly through increased mining revenues and partly through partnerships with other African countries. Ibrahim's approach to regional diplomacy also reflected his Pan-African vision. He strengthened ties with Ghana, Mali, and other neighboring countries, proposing joint projects for infrastructure development, educational exchange, and security cooperation. He argued that African countries needed to work together rather than competing for favor from former colonial powers. The young leader's most audacious international initiative was his proposal for an African development bank that would be controlled entirely by African governments rather than Western institutions. Speaking at an African Union summit in Addis Ababa, Ibrahim challenged his fellow heads of state to imagine what the continent could achieve if development financing came with African priorities rather than foreign conditions. Ibrahim's speech in Addis Ababa was widely regarded as a defining moment in his emergence as a continental leader. He spoke without notes, his passion evident as he described a vision of Africa as a continent of equals rather than aid recipients. He challenged older leaders to think beyond their immediate political interests and consider what kind of continent they wanted to leave for their children. However, Ibrahim's rapid rise and radical policies also created serious enemies. Several Western governments began pressuring other African countries to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. International banks made it difficult for Burkinabe businesses to access credit. Some international development programs were quietly terminated as punishment for the country's independent stance. These external pressures created internal challenges for Ibrahim's government. Some business leaders who had connections with foreign companies complained that his policies were hurting their operations. Some opposition politicians argued that he was being unnecessarily confrontational with important international partners. Ibrahim's response to these criticisms was characteristically direct and thoughtful. During a national television address, he acknowledged that independence came with costs and sacrifices. He pointed out that Burkina Faso had been receiving international aid and maintaining good relations with foreign powers for decades, yet remained one of the world's poorest countries despite its valuable natural resources. The security situation also remained a major challenge throughout 2023. While Ibrahim's military reforms had improved government forces' effectiveness, jihadist groups continued launching attacks in northern regions. The young president had to balance military responses with efforts to address underlying social and economic problems that contributed to instability. Ibrahim's approach to counterterrorism was notably different from regional approaches that relied heavily on foreign military assistance. He emphasized community engagement, job creation, and educational programs in affected areas. He argued that military action alone could not solve problems rooted in poverty, marginalization, and lack of opportunity. One of Ibrahim's most successful initiatives was the creation of civilian defense groups in vulnerable communities. Rather than simply relying on government soldiers who often came from different ethnic groups and regions, local communities were trained and equipped to defend themselves against terrorist attacks. This approach proved highly effective and was copied by neighboring countries. By the end of 2023, Ibrahim had transformed not only Burkina Faso's policies, but also continental discussions about African development and independence. His speeches were quoted in universities across Africa, and young people throughout the continent began calling for similar leadership in their own countries. Ibrahim's influence extended beyond politics to cultural and intellectual spheres. He promoted African languages and culture while maintaining practical engagement with the global economy. He supported local musicians, artists, and writers who celebrated African identity and criticized neo-colonial relationships. The young president's personal life also attracted attention and admiration. Despite his high position, he maintained simple habits and close relationships with family and old friends. He was often seen at local football matches, eating in ordinary restaurants, and shopping in traditional markets. This accessibility enhanced his popularity and distinguished him from typical political leaders who isolated themselves from ordinary citizens. As 2024 approached, Ibrahim Traoré had established himself as one of Africa's most influential leaders despite being in power for barely over a year. His combination of youth, intelligence, principles, and practical results had captured imaginations across the continent and beyond. International observers who had initially dismissed him as another military coup leader were beginning to take his vision seriously. The year 2024 began with Ibrahim Traoré facing his greatest test yet as a leader. International pressure on Burkina Faso had intensified, with several Western countries imposing economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation. However, instead of weakening his position, these challenges seemed to strengthen Ibrahim's resolve and increase his support among ordinary Burkinabe citizens who viewed the sanctions as proof that their president was truly fighting for their interests. Ibrahim's response to international pressure was masterful and unexpected. Instead of becoming defensive or aggressive, he launched a global communication campaign to explain his policies and vision to international audiences. He began giving interviews to major international media outlets, speaking in fluent French and English to reach different audiences around the world. During a particularly memorable interview with a prominent international news network, Ibrahim calmly explained why Burkina Faso had chosen independence over dependence. When the interviewer challenged him about economic costs of his policies, Ibrahim pulled out his phone and showed recent statistics demonstrating that despite sanctions, Burkina Faso's economy was actually growing faster than it had in years. The young president's media strategy was revolutionary for an African leader. Instead of only speaking to friendly audiences, he actively sought out challenging interviews and debates. He appeared at international conferences where he knew he would face criticism, using these opportunities to articulate his vision and challenge assumptions about African development. Ibrahim's most significant international breakthrough came when he was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Many expected him to be out of place among wealthy business leaders and established politicians. Instead, his presentation about African solutions for African problems received standing ovations and generated intense discussion among global leaders. At Davos, Ibrahim presented detailed data showing how traditional development approaches had failed to reduce poverty in Africa, despite decades of international aid and investment. He argued that real development required local ownership, fair trade relationships, and respect for African sovereignty. His presentation was so compelling that several European business leaders privately approached him about potential partnerships under new, more equitable terms. The Davos speech marked a turning point in international perceptions of Ibrahim and his leadership. Major newspapers that had previously criticized him as another African dictator began publishing more nuanced analyses of his policies and achievements. Academic institutions invited him to speak, and several universities began case studies of Burkina Faso's transformation under his leadership. Meanwhile, Ibrahim's domestic achievements continued to accumulate. The security situation in northern Burkina Faso had improved significantly due to his community-focused approach to counter-terrorism. Economic growth was accelerating as new mining contracts brought more revenue to the government. Most importantly, there were visible improvements in education, healthcare, and infrastructure that ordinary citizens could see and appreciate. Ibrahim's educational reforms were particularly impressive. He launched a massive school construction program with the goal of ensuring every child in Burkina Faso could attend primary school within walking distance of their home. He also reformed the curriculum to include more African history and culture, while maintaining high standards in mathematics, science, and technology. The young president's approach to healthcare was equally innovative. Instead of building expensive hospitals in major cities, he focused on training community health workers and building basic clinics in rural areas. This strategy provided healthcare access to millions of people who had previously been excluded from the formal medical system. Ibrahim's infrastructure projects were designed with sustainability and local capacity in mind. Instead of hiring foreign companies to build roads and bridges, his government invested in training Burkinabe engineers and construction workers. Projects took longer to complete but created local employment and built domestic capacity for future development. Perhaps most remarkably, Ibrahim achieved all of this while maintaining democratic institutions and civil liberties. Unlike many military leaders who restricted press freedom and political opposition, he actively encouraged debate and criticism. Opposition parties were allowed to organize and express their views, though they struggled to gain support given the popularity of Ibrahim's policies. International human rights organizations, which had initially expressed concern about military rule in Burkina Faso, began acknowledging that civil liberties were actually better protected under Ibrahim's leadership than they had been under previous civilian governments. Press freedom increased, corruption decreased, and citizens felt more able to express their opinions without fear. Ibrahim's growing international profile also attracted attention from other developing countries facing similar challenges. Presidents and prime ministers from across Africa, Asia, and Latin America began visiting Burkina Faso to study his approaches to development, governance, and independence. These visits helped build new partnerships and alliances that reduced Burkina Faso's dependence on traditional Western relationships. The young president's influence on continental politics became even more evident during the 2024 African Union Summit, where he delivered a keynote address that many observers considered the most important speech by an African leader in decades. Ibrahim challenged his fellow heads of state to break free from colonial mentalities and work together for genuine African unity and development. During his AU speech, Ibrahim presented a detailed plan for African economic integration that would reduce dependence on external markets and strengthen intra-African trade. He proposed common policies on resource extraction, currency cooperation, and industrial development that could benefit all African countries while maintaining their individual sovereignty. The response to Ibrahim's AU speech was electric. Younger, African leaders embraced his vision enthusiastically, while even some older heads of state acknowledged the power of his arguments. Several countries announced their intention to follow Burkina Faso's example in renegotiating unfavorable international agreements and asserting greater control over their natural resources. Ibrahim's growing influence also extended to global discussions about climate change and environmental protection. Despite being focused on economic development, he made environmental sustainability a key priority for Burkina Faso. His government launched massive tree planting campaigns and invested in solar energy projects that provided electricity to rural communities while protecting the environment. The young president's environmental initiatives attracted praise from international conservation organizations and helped counter criticism that his development policies were environmentally destructive. Ibrahim argued that poverty was itself a major environmental threat, and that sustainable development required both economic growth and environmental protection. As 2024 progressed, it became increasingly clear that Ibrahim Traoré was not just another African president but a transformational leader, whose influence extended far beyond his small country's borders. His combination of practical achievements, visionary thinking, and moral authority had created a new model of leadership that inspired millions of people around the world. The culmination of growing international recognition came in late 2024, when several prominent international organizations began discussing Ibrahim for major awards and honors. His success in combining political stability, economic growth, social progress, and environmental sustainability, while maintaining democratic values, had created a compelling case for global recognition of his achievements. The morning of December 15, 2024, would forever be remembered as a historic moment for Africa and the developing world. Ibrahim Traoré was working in his modest office at the military base he still called home when his aide rushed in with news that would change everything. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee in Oslo had just announced that Ibrahim Traoré, at 36 years old, had been nominated for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. The nomination citation was extraordinary in its praise. The Norwegian Nobel Committee highlighted Ibrahim's revolutionary approach to achieving peace through economic justice, democratic governance, and continental solidarity. They specifically mentioned his success in reducing conflict in Burkina Faso while promoting human dignity and self-determination across Africa. Ibrahim's initial reaction was characteristically humble. Instead of celebrating, he immediately called a meeting with his closest advisors to discuss how this recognition could be used to advance Africa's development rather than simply enhance his personal reputation. He understood that the Nobel nomination was not just about him but about the larger movement.